Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving into a time period often labeled the Roaring Twenties, spanning roughly 1920 to 1932. But that name, well, it only captures half the story, doesn't it?
Exactly. Our sources describe this as a really dizzying decade. On one hand, you have this unprecedented prosperity, startling technological innovation, and cultural liberation.
Right.
But on the other hand, this era was marked by deep internal fear and almost, hysterical American desire to turn inward, denounce radical foreign ideas, and cling fiercely to conservative Republican leadership under Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover.
So our mission today is to analyze this high-speed, credit-fueled ascent and understand exactly how those internal anxieties and structural economic flaws culminated in the terrifying crash that became the Great Depression. Let's jump right in with the engine that drove the decade, the new industrial system.
Yeah, this wasn't just like incremental growth, it was a fundamental shift. The entire economy basically reorganized itself around mass production techniques, assembly lines, standardized parts. This manufacturing revolution allowed America to just flood its own markets with goods.
And nothing symbolizes this better than the automobile. We're talking Henry Ford and the reliable, ubiquitous Model T, the Tin Lizzie. It became so efficient to produce that by the mid-1920s, a thrifty worker could buy one for, what, only $260?
That's right, just $260. That affordability was the direct result of Fordism, the moving assembly line technique. This was inspired by Frederick W. Taylor's scientific management, which focused, on eliminating every single wasted motion.
Incredible.
By the end of the decade, Americans owned 23 million cars. That's more than the entire rest of the world combined.
That's a staggering figure.
Yeah.
What stands out to me here is the sweeping societal reorganization the car caused.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. Suburban sprawl, the creation of massive service industries like oil and highway construction, and even new patterns of courtship.
Oh, absolutely.
The car was such a potent symbol of change that, as our sources note, the older generation condemned it as a house of prostitution on wheels. Wild.
That anxiety about change was everywhere, yeah, even in the skies.
Yeah.
Aviation, started by the Wright brothers back in 1903, took a huge leap forward with Charles A. Lindbergh's 1927 solo flight from New York to Paris.
Ah, lucky Lindy.
His 33-hour, 39-minute journey made him the first true media-made celebrity.
And that media was key, wasn't it? Marconi's wireless led directly to voice-carrying radio. KDKA in Pittsburgh broadcast the 1920 presidential election results.
When by 1926, the first national network, NBC, was established, this meant the entire nation was, really for the first time, listening to the same entertainment, hearing the same standardized accents. Film was equally influential, though D.W. Griffith's controversial Birth of a Nation in 1915, which, glorified the KKK sex-spark protests, it really demonstrated film's monumental power. Then, in 1927, The Jazz Singer, featuring Al Jolson in blackface, became the first feature-length talkie, signaling the immediate death of silent film. Just like that.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, all this mass production and mass media created an urgent new problem for the economy. Consumption. You needed people to buy all this stuff.
Absolutely. The focus definitively shifted from mastering production to managing consumption. This is really the foundational economic change of the modern era.
Okay.
Advertising boomed. You had figures like Bruce Barton even arguing in his book, The Man Nobody Knows, that Jesus was history's greatest ad man.
Wow.
The new economics philosophy was basically possess today and pay tomorrow.
That's a massive shift. Once frugal Americans were now going deep into debt, buying cars, radios, refrigerators on credit.
And that rising consumer debt, supported by a highly speculative stock market, made the entire economy incredibly brittle and, well, vulnerable to any disruption. The foundation of the Roaring Twenties, you realize, it was debt.
That's the prosperity piece. But as the economy was speeding up and Americans were buying on credit, the culture was kind of digging in its heels. Let's pivot to the deep social and cultural conflicts, starting with that post-WWI fear of radicalism.
Oh, the Red Scare of 1919-1920 was hysterical, truly.
Yeah, right.
Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer led massive raids, rounding up something like 6,000 suspects.
6,000.
Yeah. 249 alleged alien radicals were deported on the Buford, chillingly nicknamed the Soviet Ark. Conservative business leaders used this climate, denouncing the closed-shop union system as Sovietism in disguise, just to break labor movements.
And the ultimate tragic expression of that nativist fear was the Sacco and Vanzetti case. These two Italian immigrants, known anarchists, atheists, convicted of murder in 1921. Was that execution really about the crime, or...?
Well, for many observers at the time, especially liberals, the evidence felt insufficient. The execution in 1927 really felt like a judicial lynching. Their fate seemed inextricably tied to prejudice against their identity, their beliefs.
This nativist sentiment immediately fed the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan in the early 1920s. And this wasn't just anti-black anymore.
Right.
It was broader.
Right. It became this ultra-conservative, anti-diversity movement, anti-foreign, anti-Catholic, anti-Jewish, anti-evolutionist, basically anti-modern, anti-difference.
And the political manifestation of this anti-immigrant mood was the Immigration Act of 1924. This law restricted European immigration to only 2% of that nationality's presence based on the 1890 census.
And that date, 1890, is absolutely key. It was before the massive wave of Southern and Eastern European immigration. So the law explicitly favored Northern Europeans and virtually excluded all Asians and Arabs.
It basically institutionalized a racial hierarchy. But what's fascinating is that even while the KKK and Congress were pushing for this homogenous melting pot, you had writers, the cultural pluralists, like Horace Callan and Randolph Bourne.
Yeah, they championed preserving ethnic uniqueness. They argued America should be a transnationality, not just melted down into one thing.
Interesting tension there. Then we also have the great noble experiment, Prohibition.
The 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act made alcohol illegal in 1919. This was driven by moral concern, sure, but also, frankly, the desire by some, including Southern whites wanting to control black populations, and Eastern dries wanting to improve immigrant morals to control the habits of the lower orders.
And what was the outcome? Massive failure in enforcement, right? Speakeasies everywhere, staggering organized crime.
Chicago's Scarface Al Capone was the most spectacular example, made millions, until the government finally jailed him for income tax evasion of all things.
Yet we have to note the nuance here. Bank savings did apparently increase, and death rates from alcoholism actually fell during this era. So not a total failure on all fronts.
Right, it's complicated, but the cultural battles really came to a head in the Scopes trial of 1925 in Dayton, Tennessee. This pitted fundamentalism, the belief in a literal reading of the Bible, against modernism, which sought to reconcile religion with scientific discovery, like evolution.
John T. Scopes, the teacher indicted for teaching evolution. The defense, led by Clarence Darrow, just completely ridiculed the prosecution's star witness and Bible expert, William Jennings Bryan.
Yeah, Bryan was sort of humiliated on the stand. And while Scopes was technically found guilty, fined $100, I think the trial really mocked the fundamentalist cause in the national public eye, even though they remained a potent spiritual force, especially in rural areas.
Okay, so moving past the anxieties and conflicts, there was also enormous cultural liberation happening. The flapper, for instance.
Yeah, the flapper, with her bobbed hair, rouged cheeks, shorter skirts, that sort of flat-chested, independent look. She symbolized this new freedom for women.
And this was supported by figures like Margaret Sanger leading the birth control movement.
Mm-hmm.
Alice Paul's National Women's Party started campaigning for the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA, starting in 1923.
And the writings of Sigmund Freud were widely, though sometimes, maybe inaccurately, used to justify greater sexual frankness and liberation.
This era also saw this incredible flourishing of black artistic life. The Great Migration had fostered new racial pride, centered in places like Harlem.
Absolutely. Harlem had, 150,000 African-American residents? The Harlem Renaissance produced these powerful voices like Langston Hughes with his poetry collection, The Weary Blues.
And political leaders like Marcus Garvey, founder of the UNIA, who promoted black economic self-reliance and even resettlement in Africa.
That's right. And of course, the sacred music of the era was jazz, born with black musicians like Louis Armstrong and Joe Kane Oliver. It migrated north and just captured the spirit of the time, became the soundtrack.
The trauma of the war also deeply shook traditional values, creating that famous lost generation of writers seeking new codes of expression, right? Modernism.
Exactly. They felt the old ways didn't work anymore. You had H.L. Mencken, the bad boy of Baltimore, just railing against the middle-class bourgeoisie and Puritans.
And the literature provided such profound commentary. F. Scott Fitzgerald captured the era's blend of glamour and, well, ultimate tragedy in The Great Gatsby in 1925.
A perfect snapshot. And Ernest Hemingway, scarred by the war, developed that famously lean, hard-boiled style in works like A Farewell to Arms.
High modernists, too, like T.S. Eliot. The Wasteland captured that sense of post-war fragmentation that kind of seemed to underpin all the technological speed and chaos.
Yeah, and regionalists like Sinclair Lewis satirizing middle-class conformity in Babbitt, or William Faulkner chronicling the displacement of the Old South in The Sound and the Fury. Just an incredible literary output.
Okay, now let's turn back to the politics and the financial fragility underneath it all. The decade was presided over by conservative Republicans, starting with Warren G. Harding. Pretty weak, surrounded by cronies.
Yeah, Harding, 1921, 1923, was genial but maybe out of his depth, surrounded by the corrupt Ohio gang.
And the epitome of this corruption was the Teapot Dome scandal. Interior Secretary Albert B. Fall leasing naval oil reserves for bribes.
That's the one. In Wyoming and California, Fall eventually got convicted in 1929, went to prison. After Harding died suddenly, Calvin Coolidge took over.
Silent Cal. Described as the high priest of the great God business. He just let business run its course.
Pretty much his philosophy. Believed government intervention was the enemy of prosperity. Let business handle business.
And the Supreme Court backed this pro-business stance.
They did. In Adkins v. Children's Hospital in 1923, the court actually invalidated a minimum wage law for women. The argument was that because the 19th Amendment made women the legal equals of men, they didn't require special protective legislation anymore.
Interesting logic there. Meanwhile, on the global stage, America was pulling back. Isolationism?
Well, it was complicated. We hosted the Washington Conference in 21-22, which set that 5.5.3 naval ratio for the U.S., Britain, and Japan, and later signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact in 1928, which laughably outlawed war but lacked any enforcement teeth.
Yeah, sounds symbolic at best.
And a classic example of isolationism by proclamation, maybe? But the real isolationism came through economics.
Tariffs.
Ah, yes, the tariffs. The Fordism tariff started raising rates, and then the catastrophic Hawley-Smoot Tariff of 1930 jacked average duties up to an insane 60%.
60%. That must have crushed international trade.
It absolutely did. Crushed Europe's ability to recover and, critically, repay its war debts to the U.S.
Okay, connect the dots here. How did this debt situation work?
Right, so Europe owed the U.S. something like $10 billion in war debts. They insisted these should be canceled as war costs, but the U.S. said no. Europeans planned to pay the U.S. using German reparations.
But Germany was broke from the war and reparations themselves.
Exactly. So the Dawes Plan of 1924 basically rescheduled German payments, but it relied on U.S. private loans flowing to Germany.
So Germany could pay reparations to the Allies.
Who could then pay their war debts back to the U.S. Treasury. It was this incredibly fragile international debt merry-go-round, totally dependent on American credit continuing to flow.
Meaning the global economy was basically a house of cards built on American money.
Wow.
What about the people actually, producing the goods back home?
Farmers. Farmers were already suffering through much of the 20s, a deep depression for them. They had huge surpluses, partly thanks to increased efficiency from gas engine tractors, but prices were falling through the floor. Wheat dropped to like 57 cents a bushel.
And Coolidge didn't help.
He twice vetoed the McNary-Haugen Bill, which was designed specifically to have the government buy up those surpluses to help stabilize prices.
So the cracks were definitely showing,
Right.
but they went largely ignored until Herbert Hoover, running on rugged individualism, won the 1928 election.
Right. He defeated Alfred E. Smith, who was urban, Catholic, wet on Prohibition. Radio might have hurt Smith amplifying his New York accent and cultural differences for a national audience.
Then came the devastating end to the golden decade. The speculative bubble finally burst on Black Tuesday, October 29, 1929. Staggering paper losses. The Great Depression officially begins.
Hoover, steeped in that concept of private enterprise and rugged individualism, initially feared government handouts or doles. He favored trickle-down relief.
Which led him to establish the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, the RFC, in 1932.
Yes, to loan money primarily to big corporations, banks, railroads, hoping it would trickle down.
But critics immediately labeled that the millionaire's dole, arguing the money wasn't reaching those who needed it most on the ground.
Exactly. And his image was just permanently damaged in 1932 when the Bonus Army, around 20,000 WWI veterans demanding their deferred bonuses, marched on Washington.
And they were violently dispersed by the army,
Well,
led by General Douglas MacArthur.
yeah, tanks, tear gas. It was a PR disaster. Earned Hoover widespread public scorn, made him look callous.
And internationally, his response was also seen as weak when Japanese imperialists invaded Manchuria in September 1931.
The U.S. response was basically just the Stimson Doctrine in 1932, a declaration saying we wouldn't recognize territorial gains made by force. It had no real teeth, no enforcement mechanism.
Largely ineffective.
Pretty much. Though to his credit, Hoover did lay some groundwork for the later good neighbor policy by preparing to withdraw U.S. troops from nations like Nicaragua and Haiti, a shift away from interventionism there.
Okay, so If we look at the whole trajectory of the 1920s, you see this life lived at high velocity, fueled by technology, and crucially, credit, yet plagued by these deep internal intolerances and structural flaws.
Absolutely. And the entire decade saw this fundamental argument playing out over American identity. Should it be a single homogenous culture, which was sort of the goal of the KKK and the Immigration Act, or should it be this transnationality preserving cultural uniqueness, as the cultural pluralists argued?
That tension was right below the surface the whole time.
And the foundation was just too brittle. That reliance on international debt cycles, the internal consumer credit bubble, it meant the whole high-speed system was fundamentally unstable. The eventual crash became maybe not inevitable, but certainly widespread and catastrophic when it hit.
So what does this all mean for you listening to this? Here's something to think about. Considering the intense political and economic isolationism that dominated the 1920s, from rejecting the League of Nations to that massive Hawley-Smoot Tariff, how did this desperate desire to seal America off from the rest of the world ultimately make the global collapse of the Great Depression worse? Did it confirm that the world had truly shrunk and you couldn't actually operate in isolation anymore?
That's a powerful irony, isn't it? Aiming for isolation, but maybe achieving deeper entanglement in the catastrophe because of it.
Something to chew on. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.